Hello guys.
My wife was having an affair with our neighbor who wasn't so easy and was manipulating my wife the whole time, but not just my wife. I never thought I'd find myself writing this. For the longest time, I believed my life was picture perfect. My wife, Sophie, and I had been married for 5 years. We met in college, and from the very start, it felt like we were meant to be. We worked hard to build a life together, a beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, weekend BBQs with friends, and a shared dream of starting a family. But everything changed when Jack moved in next door. Jack was intense, to say the least. The kind of guy who thought the world revolved around him. From day one, he managed to annoy the entire neighborhood. He blasted music late into the night, parked his car wherever he pleased, and spread rumors like it was a sport. Still, Sophie and I did our best to ignore him. Life was too good to let a bad neighbor ruin it. Or so I thought. At first, Sophie was just as frustrated as I was. She'd roll her eyes at Jack's antics, joke about his middle-aged frat boy vibe, and tell me to ignore him. But something shifted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Sophie began sticking up for Jack when I'd complain. She'd tell me he was misunderstood or just going through a rough patch. I didn't think much of it, she was kind-hearted like that. Always giving people the benefit of the doubt. But then she started spending time with him. It began innocently enough, small chats over the fence, quick runs to the store together when we were out of milk. I trusted her. She was my wife, the woman who'd stood by my side through thick and thin. I figured Jack just needed a friend. Little did I know, those small moments were the beginning of the end. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Sophie had always been kind-hearted, the type to give even the most insufferable people the benefit of the doubt. So when Jack started appearing more and more in our lives, I chalked it up to her being polite. But soon, his presence became impossible to ignore. One evening, I came home to find Sophie and Jack on the couch, laughing together like old friends. He had a beer in hand and looked far too comfortable for my liking. Sophie explained it away, he'd stopped by for tools, and they just ended up chatting. I didn't argue, but something about it didn't sit right. Over the next few weeks, Jack seemed to be everywhere. He helped Sophie with odd jobs around the house, dropped by with small gestures of goodwill, and even managed to insert himself into her routine, like showing up at the same yoga class she attended. When I raised concerns, Sophie dismissed them. She claimed Jack was harmless, misunderstood, and just trying to be friendly. But his body language told a different story. Jack was always leaning in a little too close, his grin a little too knowing. Sophie, too, started to seem distant, like she was somewhere else, even when she was with me. The tipping point came on a Saturday afternoon. I overheard Jack's voice outside and stepped out to see him leaning against the fence, chatting with Sophie. His posture was casual, but something about the way he held himself felt deliberate, calculated. Sophie's body language didn't help. She wasn't brushing him off or stepping back. When Jack eventually left, I caught Sophie watching him go. That night, the unease was impossible to ignore. Lying awake, I replayed the day in my head, each detail cutting deeper than the last. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, but the cracks in our life were becoming too wide to ignore. I convinced myself things couldn't get worse. Jack was just an annoyance, a meddling neighbor with no sense of boundaries. But deep down, I couldn't shake the growing tension between Sophie and me. A week later, I came home early from work. The house was unusually quiet, no sound of Sophie's favorite podcasts or the smell of dinner cooking. As I walked upstairs, a nagging feeling crept over me. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, I saw them, Sophie and Jack, together, in our bed. Time stopped. My breath caught in my chest, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. Jack noticed me first. He sat up abruptly, his usual smugness replaced by a flash of panic. Sophie scrambled to cover herself, her face pale as she stammered excuses. But nothing she said mattered. The betrayal was a tidal wave, drowning out every word. Without saying a thing, I turned and walked out. Sophie followed me downstairs, pleading. She claimed Jack had manipulated her, that he'd been filling her head with lies and playing on her emotions. Her words barely registered. All I could think about was the image of them together. Jack, predictably, disappeared. He didn't even bother trying to defend himself, slipping out the back door like the coward he was. Over the next few days, the reality of what had happened sank in. Sophie begged for forgiveness, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. She finally moved out, taking only what she needed. I was left in the shell of what used to be our life, surrounded by reminders of a trust that was now shattered. I thought that was the worst of it, but a month later, Sophie called. She was pregnant. Sophie's call left me frozen. Pregnant. The word echoed in my mind as she explained the timeline and swore she wasn't sure who the father was. It didn't matter. The damage was done. I refused to play along with her half-baked hope that we could work through this. The trust was gone, and so was any future I had imagined with her. I told her to figure it out with Jack. But Jack, true to form, was already backing out. Word spread fast in the neighborhood, and his carefully crafted image began to crumble. Women started coming forward, one by one, sharing stories about his lies and manipulation. As it turned out, Jack wasn't just Sophie's mistake, he was a serial liar. The final blow came when a woman from a nearby block exposed the truth: Jack was married. He had a wife and 2 kids in another state. They'd been separated, but his wife hadn't finalized the divorce because Jack was living off her inheritance. Furious, she traveled to confront him, dragging along years' worth of damning evidence. The neighborhood was buzzing. Jack's wife went scorched earth, revealing everything: his fake career, his multiple affairs, his financial leeching. It was like a soap opera playing out in real time. For Sophie, the fallout was brutal. She lost her job when her co-workers caught wind of her affair, and her reputation in the neighborhood was in tatters. Jack wasn't around to help either. He disappeared completely, likely running to con his next victim. As for me, I finalized my divorce and put the house on the market. The life Sophie and I built was beyond saving. One day, Sophie called again. She'd confirmed the baby was Jack's, not mine. She sounded exhausted, broken, and desperate to reconcile. But I couldn't. I told her to focus on raising her child and hung up. After Sophie's call, I knew it was time to truly move on. The house, once a symbol of the life we'd built together, had become suffocating. Every corner, every piece of furniture felt like a reminder of the betrayal. I sold it faster than I thought possible and moved to a new city, one where no one knew my name or my story. Starting over was harder than I expected. For weeks, I wrestled with the anger and grief, replaying every moment that had led to my marriage's collapse. I kept asking myself how I could have missed the signs or been so naive about Jack's intentions. But at some point, I realized the endless self-blame was holding me back. I threw myself into work, focusing on a promotion I'd been eyeing for years. I joined a local gym, something I'd been meaning to do for ages, and even started hiking on weekends. It wasn't about running away from the past, it was about finding something that was just for me. Surprisingly, I also started therapy. At first, it felt strange opening up to a stranger about my feelings, but it quickly became the lifeline I didn't know I needed. My therapist helped me unpack not only the betrayal but also the insecurities I'd carried for years. For the first time, I began to understand that Sophie's actions said more about her than they did about me. Meanwhile, Sophie's life was falling apart. She reached out a few more times, usually with updates about her struggles raising Jack's baby alone. Each time, I responded with as much kindness as I could muster, but I made it clear, there was no going back. She had chosen her path, and I had to focus on mine. As for Jack, he was nowhere to be found. The last I heard, his wife had drained their shared accounts and filed for divorce. Rumor had it he was living in a motel somewhere, trying to dodge lawsuits and angry exes. It was satisfying to know that karma had finally caught up to him, but I didn't dwell on it. In my new city, life slowly began to take shape. I made new friends, found new hobbies, and even started dating again. At first, I was guarded, but over time, I realized that not everyone would hurt me the way Sophie had. This chapter of my life taught me resilience. I learned how to let go, how to heal, and how to rebuild. I wasn't just moving on, I was moving forward. Moving forward didn't mean I had all the answers, or that the past stopped haunting me. Some nights, I still woke up replaying Sophie's betrayal in my head. Other times, anger surged out of nowhere, especially when I thought about Jack. But as time went on, those moments grew fewer, replaced by a quiet acceptance. One evening, months after moving to my new city, I got an unexpected message from Sophie. It was long, full of apologies and regrets. She wrote about how she destroyed her own life and how raising Jack's child alone had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. She admitted she still loved me and asked if we could meet to talk. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I told myself it was for closure, to say what I needed to say and finally close that door for good. We met at a quiet cafe. Sophie looked like a shadow of the person I once knew. She was thinner, her eyes tired, but the guilt in her expression was unmistakable. She apologized again, tears streaming down her face, telling me how she'd let her insecurities and Jack's lies cloud her judgment. "You didn't deserve any of this," she said. "I was weak, and I destroyed the best thing in my life." Hearing her say it should have been satisfying, but instead, I just felt tired. I told her I forgave her, not for her sake, but for mine. Carrying the anger around had been exhausting, and I didn't want it to define me anymore. But forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. When she hinted at wanting another chance, I made it clear there was no going back. Too much had been broken, and I was finally in a place where I didn't need her to fix me. After that meeting, I felt lighter. For the first time, I could look at the past without bitterness. Meanwhile, Jack's downfall had become something of a local legend back in our old neighborhood. His ex-wife's scorched earth campaign had left him with nothing, and he'd been forced to leave town entirely. He was still running, from debts, from angry women he'd lied to, and from the life he'd built on deceit. I didn't feel sorry for him. Jack had sown his seeds of chaos, and now he was reaping the consequences. But I also realized I didn't need to think about him, or Sophie, anymore. Their story wasn't my story. Life after closure felt like stepping into fresh air after years of being stuck in a storm. My job was thriving, my new friendships felt genuine, and for the first time in years, I was excited about the future. Once I let go of the past, life began to feel brighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, wondering what could have been or what had gone wrong. I started focusing on what I wanted, not just in my career but in life as a whole. Work became my anchor. After landing a promotion, I threw myself into new projects, eager to prove I'd earned my place. It was rewarding, not just for the paycheck, but for the sense of accomplishment I felt every time I closed a deal or led a successful team. Work filled my days, but it was the evenings and weekends that brought real joy. I found myself exploring hobbies I hadn't touched in years. I joined a hiking club and discovered the peace of early morning treks through the mountains. I took up cooking, experimenting with dishes far beyond the basics I used to rely on. And slowly, I built a circle of new friends, people who knew me as the person I was now, not the person weighed down by betrayal. One of those friends was Emily. We met at a book club, of all places, a suggestion from my therapist to try something social but low pressure. Emily had this warmth about her, the kind of presence that put people at ease. We bonded over a shared love of cheesy sci-fi novels and terrible movie adaptations. At first, it was purely friendship. I wasn't ready for anything more, and Emily respected that. But as the months passed, something shifted. She wasn't just a friend anymore, she was someone who made me laugh, who listened when I talked about my goals and fears, and who reminded me what it felt like to trust someone. When I finally told her about Sophie and Jack, I expected the usual awkwardness that followed such confessions. But Emily didn't flinch. "You went through hell," she said, "but look where you are now." It wasn't love at first sight, and it didn't need to be. What we had was slow and steady, built on honesty and mutual respect. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine a future with someone. As for Sophie, her life had taken a harsher turn. I heard from mutual acquaintances that she'd moved out of the neighborhood entirely. Raising Jack's child alone had been more challenging than she'd anticipated, and without a solid support system, she was struggling. There was a time when hearing about her struggles would have brought me satisfaction, but now it just felt distant. Her choices were her own, and I didn't need to carry her pain anymore. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Each day felt like a step forward, a chance to rebuild not just what I'd lost, but something entirely new. When I finally let go of the past, it felt like I could breathe again. My relationship with Emily was unlike anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't built on grand gestures or intense highs and lows but on trust, respect, and shared laughter. With her, life felt steady and safe, a kind of happiness I didn't know I needed. One Saturday morning, we decided to tackle a challenging hiking trail. Emily joked that I'd need to earn the breakfast burritos we'd planned to grab afterward. By the time we reached the summit, I was exhausted, but the view was breathtaking. As we sat catching our breath, Emily looked out over the city and said, "You've changed so much since I met you. You were carrying so much weight then, but now you seem lighter." Her words stayed with me. She was right. The anger and bitterness I had clung to for so long had faded, replaced by a quiet contentment. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. Weeks later, Emily invited me to meet her family. It felt like a big step, one I hadn't taken since Sophie. Her parents were warm and welcoming, the kind of people who made you feel at home within minutes. Her younger brother, a budding chef, grilled me about my favorite foods, promising to recreate them the next time I visited. That evening, surrounded by her family, I realized what I'd been missing all these years. This was what family could be, a source of support, not pain. As my life with Emily blossomed, Sophie's struggles became a distant memory. I occasionally heard updates from mutual acquaintances. She had moved back to her hometown to be closer to her parents and was working a retail job to support Jack's child. She was doing the best she could, but without Jack's help, life was far from easy. There was a time when hearing about her hardships might have given me a sense of vindication, but now, it just felt irrelevant. Sophie's choices were her own, and I no longer had to carry the weight of them. One quiet evening, Emily and I were curled up on the couch, binging our favorite sci-fi show. She turned to me suddenly, her expression serious yet soft. "I hope you know you deserve this," she said. "You deserve us." I didn't say anything for a moment, unsure how to put into words how much her presence meant to me. Instead, I pulled her close, grateful for the second chance life had given me. This wasn't just the start of something new, it was the life I'd fought so hard to rebuild. I had survived betrayal, learned to let go of bitterness, and opened myself to trust again. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back. I was only looking forward. Life with Emily was everything I didn't know I needed. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real, and it was ours. The longer we were together, the more I realized how much my previous relationship had chipped away at my sense of self. With Emily, it was the opposite. She brought out the best in me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly seen. Work was thriving, too. After years of climbing the ladder, I landed a leadership role in my company, a position I'd once thought was out of reach. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same promotion I'd been pursuing during my marriage finally became mine once I left all that behind. I threw myself into new challenges, and the confidence I gained in my professional life spilled into every other aspect of who I was becoming. Emily and I made a point to travel whenever we could. Weekend trips to the mountains, long drives to the coast, and even a spontaneous flight to Seattle just to see the cherry blossoms. Each adventure felt like a step further from the life I'd left behind. One day, as we walked along a quiet beach, Emily brought up something we hadn't talked about before, the future. "Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" she asked, her tone casual but curious. For the first time in a long time, I didn't hesitate. "Here," I said, gesturing at the water, the sand, and, most importantly, at her. She smiled, a mix of relief and happiness crossing her face. "Good," she replied. "Because I'm not going anywhere." Meanwhile, Sophie's story continued to fade into the background. I heard she was still in her hometown, trying to make things work as a single mom. The child Jack had left her with was growing up fast, and while I couldn't say I wished her ill, I also didn't dwell on her life. She was part of my past, a chapter long since closed. Jack, on the other hand, remained a ghost. No one in the old neighborhood had seen or heard from him since his ex-wife exposed his lies. Some speculated he was trying to con a new community, while others thought he'd finally hit rock bottom. Either way, I didn't care. His chaos was no longer my concern. As the months turned into years, Emily and I built a life together. It was filled with laughter, quiet moments, and shared dreams. We weren't rushing anything, but I knew deep down she was the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. The scars from my past didn't disappear, but they stopped defining me. I had learned to carry them differently, as reminders of what I'd overcome rather than weights holding me back. This wasn't just a new chapter, it was the story I had been waiting to live all along. It happened on an ordinary Sunday morning, the kind where everything feels just right. Emily and I were at the park, sipping coffee and watching a group of kids fly kites in the breeze. The world seemed so peaceful in that moment, but in my heart, I knew something big was about to change. "Do you ever think about the future?" I asked her, breaking the comfortable silence. She raised an eyebrow and smirked. "Pretty sure we've had this conversation before." I nodded, smiling. "Yeah, but I mean, our future. Together." Emily set her coffee down and looked at me, her eyes warm and curious. "What are you trying to say?" I reached into my pocket, pulling out the small velvet box that had been burning a hole there for weeks. I didn't drop to one knee, I didn't need to. This wasn't about grand gestures or perfectly rehearsed speeches. It was just about her, about us. "I'm saying I don't want to imagine my future without you," I said, opening the box to reveal the ring. "Will you marry me?" For a second, her face was unreadable, and my heart froze. But then her lips parted into the biggest smile I'd ever seen, and she whispered, "Yes." We laughed and hugged, both overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. People around us clapped, but it felt like we were the only two people in the world. The engagement wasn't just a new step in my relationship with Emily, it was the final piece of my healing. I had spent so long feeling broken, like I wasn't good enough or deserving of love. But here I was, standing beside someone who loved me for exactly who I was. Planning our wedding was surreal. Unlike the chaotic, tension-filled mess of my first marriage, this time, it was about joy. Emily and I kept it simple, a small ceremony with our closest friends and family. Her brother cooked an incredible dinner for the reception, and the night was filled with laughter, dancing, and warmth. Sophie found out about my engagement through mutual acquaintances. She sent a short message congratulating me, and though it was a little bittersweet to hear from her, I realized something important. I didn't feel anything anymore. No anger, no sadness, just peace. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. As for Jack, he remained a ghost of the past. His name barely crossed my mind anymore, except as a reminder of how far I'd come. Standing beside Emily on our wedding day, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not just for her, but for the journey that had brought me here. The betrayal, the heartbreak, and the rebuilding, it had all led to this moment. This wasn't the life I'd planned all those years ago, but it was better. It was mine. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was running from the past. I was running toward the future. With Emily by my side, it was a future worth fighting for.
See you later.